See if I can get you out of here before this place heats up today. I also want to thank you guys who came Monday night and helped move the playground stuff, and hopefully they'll come and get the ark moved soon. And a lot of guys showed up, and it didn't take any time at all. I appreciate you guys. You guys have always impressed me through the years. When we say we need you, you're here, and I just appreciate you so much. Kenny and I was doing some pre-labor on that before you guys got here on Monday, and we were putting down mulch and planting some trees around there so that we can begin to make the back look better. We've just kind of left the back the way it was because there wasn't anything supposed to go on back there until we built the gymnasium down the road. But then we had some plans to put a sand volleyball court where the playground is now. We didn't know that AEP was going to build a new substation next door, so construction is going to begin soon over there. And we may have to block the windows there on Sunday for a while so nobody will look out the windows because there's not going to be any trees there for a while. And they're going to clear all that out, even though a lot of it's on our property. We've given them permission to bring their ground up level with ours. Then there's going to be landscaping and stuff in there. And so when it's all said and done, we're trusting it's going to be okay. And it's, like I said, as soon as I figure out how to run some extension cords under the fence over there and plug into those big things, it's going to be real good. Free juice, man, from now on. And Kenny and I was back there planting some trees. We bought a bunch of different kinds of flowering cherry trees, so in the spring they'll grow up and it'll be just real beautiful back there in the spring, all kinds of pink and red flowers. And I was we were digging the holes, which was not very easy because it's all fill dirt back there. And I took the containers off of the roots, and I started rubbing the roots real hard and roughing them up. And Kenny's just kind of standing there. He's my helper, and he never knows why I'm doing hardly anything I do. And sometimes I think he thinks I'm doing it just to get a rise out of him, and not knowing that I really know what I'm doing sometimes. And I'm roughing up the roots on the bottom of the side and real hard and shaking some dirt out of it and then putting the ground. And I can tell he's giving me the eyebrow, like, what are you doing? And I finally said, so Kenny, you're wondering what I'm doing to these roots before we put them in the ground, aren't you? And he said, yeah. I said, well, I'm roughing up the roots. I said, did you notice? And I pulled one out of the container. I said, see how this has been growing in the container, how the roots are just going round and around in that container? And there's a picture of that in the Bible, you know. The wilderness, 40 years, round and round and round the same place. I said, if I just pull this out of the container and put it right in the ground, I said, there's a good chance if it's a dry summer, this tree is going to die before the roots extend out because it's going to be hard for the roots to break out of that pattern by themselves. They're going to want to just keep going round and round. So, but when I start roughing them up and I start breaking them loose, and then you notice that there's little fingers just going out everywhere now. I said, you got to rough up the roots so that you put this thing in the ground, it'll start growing. And as I even said that to him, I realized that absolutely is our specialty at Cornerstone Family Church, roughing up your roots. I don't care if you've come in unchurched and this is your first church experience, or you've come in where you've been in church for a while from some denomination, but it was always that way that they did it in that denomination. Or you've been in church and maybe in growing, thriving, bouncing off the wall churches, man, where the Spirit of God was there, man, and stuff was happening. It makes no difference. If you come here, you have to be ready to have your roots roughed up. Because if you come here and we just take you and we plant you in the ground here at Cornerstone and we don't rough up your roots a little bit from time to time, you're just going to keep circling around where you've already been. And I don't care where you've come from and how good it is. I can promise you there are no exceptions. Whatever you have believed, no matter how true it was, is not the whole truth. And I can promise you, if you do what Israel did many times and you just find a good place and you set up camp and you set up shop and you stay there, you'll be just like Abraham's father. He set up shop in a place called Haran, and it became a dry, barren place, and the Bible said that he died there. But when they settled there, you have to understand that it looked pretty good when they settled there. It looked like a really good place. And so no matter what your church heritage has taught you, I'm telling you, if you're not going along in some deeper revelation, you're just not going to grow. It's imperative that from time to time that you hear me say things to you that make you go, do what? If you're only going to sit there and agree with everything I say, you're not going to grow in this church. It's very important that you are challenged. You are challenged in your doctrine. You are challenged theologically. You're challenged with church protocols. You're challenged with how you think church is supposed to be. Because I want you to know, I don't care who you are and where you came from, I can tell you we're all in the same boat. Way over half of the stuff we do in church is American church heritage more than Scripture. Doesn't mean that it's been bad. It doesn't mean that we're heretics and lunatics and a cult. It just means that this is how you grow up. And when you're a kid, you think as a kid and you do things the way kids do it, and then when you're no longer a child, you stop thinking like a child. And I'm not sure when we find the end of this thing. But I can tell you the Lord has not stopped stretching me. And there's things I preached 10 years ago, hot and heavy, with great conviction that I don't preach anymore because I realized it wasn't the whole truth. There's things that I preached that was really good at the time because it's where we were. It's where I was. But it's not where we need to be now. It's important that you let your roots get roughed up here so that you can grow and you can branch out into some deeper waters. It's important. Get your roots roughed up. In the American church, if you were here last week, we've become artists at learning how to bypass the protocols of God. God puts things in motion from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden. God gave us the whole pattern for existence, for humanity, for living life to its fullness. God gave us the perfect pattern in the garden, and then He repetitively kept giving us that pattern over and over all through the Bible. It's a pattern that contains order, specific order, not legalism, not law, but an order to how life must be. And all through the Bible, God has given us pictures. And He comes to Moses and He says, I need you to build me a house. We understand spiritually that the tabernacle represented the church, the body of Christ. And He said, and here's the plan, here's the protocol. You've got to build it like this, in this order. He does that. Paul talks about us being a body and how we're many parts, but we're put together just right. How many of you guys know that if you take our body parts that are functioning pretty well right now and you reassimilate them in different order, it's probably not going to work anymore. It's the same parts, but the wrong order. I want you to think about that for a second. It's not just about getting all the right pieces together in a big box. And we've done that in church. We've grabbed all the right theological pieces and we put them in these boxes we call church buildings, and we say we've got all we need. But we're missing the primary point of God in living a constructive life. Putting the pieces together in order. There's a method to building a house. There's a method to how a body must be formed in a mother's womb where it functions. There's a method to it. In creation, there was a method to how the days of creation had to be ordered, and every day prepared for the next day. The order of God. And we've sidestepped things. And we've done a lot of things that were okay at the time, but maybe they're not going to be so okay in the future. If you've been around, you have to excuse some of my pet peeves. Because I used to practice a lot of my pet peeves because at the time, they made sense and they were functional and they were fruitful at the time. But as we progress in the body of Christ, we have to stretch, Isaiah said. We've got to extend our tent stakes and our cords. We've got to spread our tent curtains out. He was talking about if you want to get pregnant with new things. He was talking to women who were barren, spiritually speaking, the woman, the church. Says, but I'm barren, I'm empty, there's nothing happening. He said, then you're going to have to stretch. If you want to get pregnant, your body's going to have to stretch. You're going to have to go places you've never been before. And there's many protocols that over time at Cornerstone we have laid aside. And as I meet weekly with pastors, easier in places like this than in denominational circles, pastors are everything from excited to stressed as they are hearing the trumpet of God being sounded into the earth, as God sends a messenger out into the cloud and blasts and says, now here's what we do. Do this now. Beautiful picture all through the revelation of Jesus Christ. The prophetic voice of God says, now do this, now do this, now do this, now build this, now add this component. And churches tend to just set up camp and stay there. And that's why all through church history, there's never been one single denomination, organization, or church structure that's ever stood. Not one single time so far. Not once. Not one single time. We look out there and we go, okay, so what's the biggest denomination out there? Probably Southern Baptist. Well, Southern Baptist hasn't always existed. Guess what? Southern Baptist isn't going to always exist in the future. History will continue to repeat itself. Something will birth, it will live, and it will die. Because we always turn it into a man-made government. And we have more in our handbooks that we practice than we do God's books sometimes. In fact, a lot of times. It's imperative that in churches all over America today that we rough up people's roots and we make them think. We challenge you. There's things that like apologetics that only theological students took in seminary many years ago that now pastors are pressing into their congregations. Apologetics is simply the theological understandings in a personal way, why I believe what I believe, so I can defend to myself why I believe this. Forget everybody else, but here's why I believe what I believe. Convictions can be built on many things. Let me tell you, when somebody straps a bomb to their chest and they walk into a crowded restaurant and they blow themselves up with 50 other people, they are acting on true, deep conviction when they do that. Conviction can be built on anything. But if we don't build on truth and we're only building on pieces of truth, now the house is on sifting sand, because sand is very small particles of rock. It's a little fact here, a fact here, a fact here, a fact here. But it's not the same as the rock. And we've got to keep growing. And even in seasons like this now where we're talking about godliness, being made in His image, we're not presenting godliness to you the way that our fathers did and our fathers before Him. My grandfather's old-time religion, it ain't good enough for me. He doesn't see what I see, and I say that with all humility. My grandfather was a brush arbor preacher, and that dude spent his life preaching the gospel. There are thousands that ended up followers of Jesus Christ because of my grandfather. But I want you to know, the glass was much darker for my grandfather than it is for me. And the glass I'm looking through is much darker than it's going to be for my daughter someday. You guys want to believe that for your own children? Absolutely, you should. We've got to be in a place where we can be stretched. And even when we're in seasons like this where we're talking about godliness and we're presenting it in completely different ways than maybe if you grew up in a Pentecostal church. Because when we talked about holiness and godliness, we were talking mostly about things we should refrain from. When in fact, that's not what godliness was talking about at all. It meant being like God. Being like God has very little to do with refraining from anything. God doesn't struggle with sin. Did you know that? God doesn't struggle with sin. So why should my godliness be a struggle to refrain from sin when God doesn't struggle with sin? So how is that being like God if I'm struggling to refrain from sin? But I learned that if I truly take on the nature, become like God, that suddenly my struggles aren't so much of a struggle anymore. We try to stop sinning by preaching and practicing stop sinning. And Paul already told us, so we wouldn't waste our time. The more I try not to do what's wrong, I do it. The more I try to do right, I get it backwards. And the more I try to refrain from doing wrong, I end up doing wrong. And he's trying to tell you, man, that legalistic approach to life will kill you. It's not about trying to not be human. It's not about trying not to be less than perfect. You will fail at those things miserably. The challenge in life is to become like God. Not do the things that God does not do, but be the things that God is. Do the things that God does. The Bible calls it godliness, and the Bible links everything we're seeking for to the achievement of godliness. With each new portion of godliness in our life comes a new portion of abundant life and power for living. A sound mind and joy and peace and all the things that our heart aches for is linked directly to godliness. And godliness is linked directly to getting back to the pattern of God and building the house the way that God said to build it. If you were here last week, we talked about order. Said you can't bypass the order of God. You can't do it. I don't care how many altar calls you respond to, how many people lay hands on you, how many people prophesy over you. If you are missing the order of God, you're still in a pit. I use the example all the time that people can relate to. You can turn to the four winds. For those of you that have come up through some of the movements I have, you can turn to the four winds and you can prophesy and declare money cometh all day long. But if you ain't bringing the tithe in the storehouse, however, if you bring the tithe in the storehouse, now you don't have to spend all this time laboring going, money cometh, money cometh, money cometh. It was good in the moment, but we're more enlightened now. And as we're getting deeper, we're actually noticing we're getting back up closer to the surface. We've gone so deep, we went through the inner core of the earth, and now we're on China soil now. We went all the way through, Terry. We found out that we made this thing real deep and complex, and we've missed the obvious. I want to show you a new attribute of God today, going back to the creation story. Something that's so simple and user-friendly. And we try to get in all this deep waters and bypass the obvious natures of God. And then we get all confused and discombobulated, and it ain't working for us, and now we're mad, and the preacher's an idiot, and the church is a bunch of jerks, and God hates me, and we get all these weird ideas only because we don't know the simple truths of what God wants us to be. And most of them are very doable things. Very doable. They're not that hard at all. Let's look back at the creation story again in Genesis chapter 1. Let's read about the first 4 verses here. I want to show you something about the nature of God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good. And He separated the light from the darkness. Let me explain to you what's going on here. God has stepped into a chaotic, dark void. It's discombobulated. It has no rhyme, no reason, no method, no purpose. It's a big mess. It has no productiveness, no fruitfulness, no function on any level whatsoever. It's chaos. God steps into it. If you were here a couple weeks ago, one of the things we learned about God is God, didn't really look at things the way that we looked at things. He looks at this mess, and instead of running from it, He becomes very proactive, is one of the things that we've learned about God. And so if we become proactive, we're being like God. We learned that God hates chaos. He hates messes. If we like messes, then we're very ungodly, even if we're very covered with the blood of the Lamb. If we like drama and we like messes and we like chaos and gossip is our national pastime and we always got to be in something that's going on, you are an ungodly Christian. So, well, that's just the way that we do it. Jerry Springer, I'm sorry, you're ungodly. I didn't say you weren't saved. I said you were ungodly, and when we're ungodly, we have no life in us. We can be bloody as the day is long with the blood of the Lamb and just as miserable as the world. God looks at this, and He looks at this mess. A mess that there can be really nothing good seen. There's not a single word used in this description that would be good on any level whatsoever. It's so dark. Put yourself in the mind of God. He's looking at this thing and saying, man, this thing is such a dark mess. I can't even see what's going on here. I can't even see what's usable parts and what needs to be thrown away. I don't even know where to start with this mess. He says, man, let's turn some lights on so we can see what's going on here. He says, let there be lights, man. Light! And the light shines, and there's light, but guess what still exists? Darkness in the midst of light. He can see the darkness now. He can see the chaos now. He can see what's discombobulated. He can see what's detached, what's unhooked, what's not in the right order. You got planets swirling around. I don't know what's going on, and big haze clouds and just, man, a mess. But now there's light. He can kind of see what's going on. You know what God saw before there was light? Chaos. You know what God saw after there was light? The chaos a whole lot better. I want you to hear this. The view has not changed just because there's light. He only sees what there is a whole lot better now. It's a bigger mess than I thought it was, now that I can see what it is. And you know what this God had the audacity to say? This is good. God, the original, eternal optimist. It's one of the first things we learn about how God is. God is incredibly optimistic. God looks at the biggest mess that the Bible could ever try to describe with human language. God shines a light on it where He can see it even better than before. And God says, this is good. And He begins to speak, and over time, over days, He begins to dabble with this thing. He begins to reconnect it, and He begins to put this thing in order. And long before it's a finished product, this Garden of Eden that anyone with even dim eyesight could look at and go, oh, that's beautiful, that's good. Long before that is the view, God, all through the creation story, says, this is good. This is good. But it's not finished, God. I know. This is good. This is good. The nature of God. He's an optimist. Optimism means seeing the best in even the worst. You need to hear this today. Because we've gotten so deep into all this stuff, and we're so busy, especially in circles that a lot of us are used to. We're so busy trying to learn how to prophesy deeper, man, and how to wage war in the heavenlies, and man, how to just do all these supernatural things. And we're doing all these, learning to do all these things, and a lot of us are still very ungodly people. And we're missing the main things God showed us would be the first things He would show us about Himself. Agreed? Agreed? The first things God would show us about Himself would be the most important things about Him and those who would now be made in His image, made to be just like Him. Optimism, it means the ability to see the best even in the worst. You know what pessimism is then, right? Seeing the worst even in the best. Without raising hands, how many of you guys know somebody like that? Without raising hands, how many of you are somebody like that? Optimists. To be an optimist means I see the positive. I see the glass is half full. I see the best. I see what's right about things. And I become a great exhorter because of it, because I'm seeing what's right. I'm looking at whatever the situation is, whether it's on the news or whether it's in my family or whether it's in my church or my neighborhood or my job or my own life, and I'm seeing the good things that's in there, and I'm becoming very optimistic. A pessimist is one who only sees the negative, only sees the worst, is quite the cynic, walks through life singing gloom, despair, and agony on me. They only see what's wrong. It was asked back in the light bulb joke days, how many pessimists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is we don't know. We can't get them in a room because when we try to tell them we need to change the light bulb, no one will show up. They say, what's the point? It'll just burn out again. There's a story of a man who loved to duck hunt, and so he searched and searched trying to find the greatest bird dog he could find. And this man was just such an optimist, and he just had to believe that there was always even a better bird dog and a better bird dog, and he would buy dogs, and finally he searched and he found the greatest bird dog out there. This bird dog could walk on water. And if you're a duck hunter, that's a big perk. So he decides he's going to go duck hunting, and he really is anxious to show off this wonderful bird dog that can walk on water. And he thinks, you know what? I'm going to invite my friend who's just the most pessimistic person in the world. Maybe this will somehow inspire him when he sees how great this dog is. So he goes and he gets his pessimistic friend and he loads him up and says, come on, let's go duck hunting. And they go out by the lake, and sure enough, here comes some ducks, and they shoot a couple ducks, and boy, that bird dog, he jumps out on the water, and he runs on top of the water, and he retrieves those ducks, and he comes back, and the optimist looks over at his friend with a, huh? The pessimists, no reaction whatsoever. Throughout the course of the day, they shoot ducks, and the dog runs out onto the lake, retrieves the ducks, and comes back. And the pessimist never says a word. And so they get in the car to go home, and finally the optimist, he just can't take it anymore and says, "But," he said, "I just got to ask you, did you not notice anything special about my dog?" The pessimist said, "Yeah, I noticed your dog can't swim." See, that's a pessimist, seeing the worst in the best. I mean, you've heard the story of the family who had twin boys, and very opposite as some twins are. One was a great optimist, the other one was a great pessimist. And finally, the parents don't know what to do with this. It's so extreme, and their whole home is becoming bipolar because of these twin boys. And so they take their sons and they take them to see Sylvia. Maybe it wasn't you, Sylvia. It was another great counselor. Took them to have them studied to see what they could do about this. They're so extreme. And so the counselors say, "Well, we've got an idea on how we're going to study these boys." And so they took one room and they filled it with all the nicest toys that any boy that age could ever want. And they took the boy who was quite the pessimist and they put him in the room and they observed him through a one-way glass. And as they watched, the pessimist just sat there and he looked around and he just broke down and he started crying. They walked in the room and they said, "What's wrong, young man? Why are you so upset?" He said, "Well, now I've got all these nice toys and, well, all my friends are going to be jealous and they're not going to like me anymore. And I know if I start playing with these toys, some of them are going to break and some of them I'm going to have to go buy batteries for." And he's all upset. He only sees the worst. In the meantime, they've taken the optimistic son because they're trying to really push the limits on this thing, and they fill a room full of horse dung. And they take the little optimistic boy and they throw him in the room, and they begin to observe through the glass, and suddenly they see the little optimistic boy is just digging down through that horse poop as fast as he can go. And they open the door and say, "Young man, what are you doing?" He said, "Man, all this horse poop in here, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere." Now, that's an optimist. Being in the worst conditions, a room full of horse poop, and he's excited because there's got to be a pony in here somewhere. It's the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Bible's full of optimists. In fact, many of the stories revolve around optimism versus pessimism. One of the more familiar stories, of course, is of Joshua and Caleb. As Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and probably within just a few weeks they're at the borders of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey, and Moses raises up 12 spies and he sends them into Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey, says, "Bring us back a report. See if this land is as good as God said it was." The 12 spies come back and Joshua and Caleb are all excited. They've brought back samples of the fruit. They got grapes as big as grapefruit. Man, they say, "You will not believe this place. This place is incredible. It's mind-blowing." They said, "This place is even better than we thought it was." You know where the reports originated from, right? God. They said, "It's even better than we heard that it was." It's incredible. And so the other 10 spies, they're sitting over here and they're whining and crying and they're sitting around with a jug of moonshine and banjos singing gloom, despair, and agony on me. Moses says, "What's wrong with you guys?" I said, "Oh yeah, the land's got some good stuff in it, but it's full of giants and enemies. We could never take this land. Why we're grasshoppers to them and we're grasshoppers in our own eyes." And Joshua and Caleb is like, "What? What are you talking about?" 40 years later, when they finally cross the river into that land, these enemies are saying, "It's about time you got here. We've been sitting here scared for the last 40 years because we knew you were going to come here and kill us and take all of our stuff." 2 spies, very optimistic. 10 spies, very pessimistic. So what happens if we have a family or a business where people are employed, or a church, or a circle of friends, and the pessimists outnumber the optimists? What happens in a church like Cornerstone Family Church? Being planted in the Appalachian Mountains, where pessimism runs through a lot of people's DNA. How does a local church ever pursue a vision where they take the ground, they take the land, they evangelize cities, and they take territories, and they make disciples out of hundreds and even thousands? They change and alter the whole land to where the next generation is just mind-blowing. How do you do that if we do not become godly and become very optimistic like God? Find the ability to see the best in even the worst instead of finding the worst in even the best. How many of you guys would agree? And we won't pick on us, we'll always pick on the last generation, and we'll call that the 20th century church at this point. How many of you guys would agree, based on the things we preached from pulpits, that we were not the most optimistic church in the world? Get us out of here. Come on, come get us, rescue us. This place is no good. It's funny because one of the last things I remember God saying was, "It's good." Even before it was finished, God said, "It's good, it's good. It's not even finished yet." And God said, "It's so good." And yet after it's finished, man goes, "It's terrible, get us out of here. We don't like this place. We're not of this world." And we preached a very pessimistic gospel of gloom, despair, and agony. God was mad. Now we're mad. Everybody's sad. There's no hope. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. Forget this kingdom at hand stuff. Let's get out of here. If His kingdom's at hand here, I'm still a little unclear where we're wanting to go to. We very much preach out of both sides of our mouth. We really do. Very double-minded. Joshua and Caleb. Who became the next leader of the next generation? Joshua. What's God trying to say? My leaders will be like me. Remember last week, Paul said, Timothy, you need to raise up leaders in the body of Christ. Elders and deacons, bishops, people that can rule in my church. And here's the protocols. He was saying they need to be godly people. They need to be like God. David, the eternal optimist, and you can't be the head of household in a more dysfunctional family environment than that man. And there was a couple times he slipped to remind us that even the great David can be human. But David was such an optimist from the time he's a little boy. He takes lunch to his brothers out on the battlefield that are cowering behind the rocks and the bushes as the Philistines taunt them. And they've got this 9.5-foot tall goofball out there that's probably so uncoordinated he probably can't even really fight. He's just big. Did you ever notice any of you guys? Gary, I'll pick on someone that I know has spent some time in the bars like I did. Did you ever notice in the bars the fight was always between the little guy and the big guy? And the little guy always tore up the big guy. The big guy, if the big guy ever got a hold of him, the little guy was dead meat. But you could never catch the little guy. Little guys were mouthy. Man, and you never knew what the little guy was going to do, man. I remember one night, years ago, no, it was last week. No, it was years ago. Because it was at a very well-known nightclub that was in our area at one time, and these two guys got into this one guy, man. This one guy was just like, he was so short, and the other guy was like this big, tall, burly guy, and I'm standing there watching this unfold, and I'm going, this little guy must have a death wish. They take it out on the sidewalk, which happened at King's Gallery a lot, if you remember those days, Joyce. You probably stayed inside, but I always wanted to go out and see the show. And I'm telling you, this big guy's out there, and he draws back his fist to hit this little guy, and before he even gets the thing back, the little guy's done smacked him 6 or 7 times. He's got his leg, and he's climbing up his leg, and he's on top of his back now, and this little guy ends up on the big guy's back and just starts pounding him in the side of the head, and the big guy's just turning around in circles with blood squirting out everywhere. Little guys, this Goliath probably wasn't that bad, just big. David brings his brothers some lunch, and I guess these guys are too scared to even leave behind their rocks to go get lunch somewhere. And little David brings them lunch. So what's going on? And, well, we're hiding here because there's a giant over there. And so he said, what are you talking about? They said, don't you see that big giant out there taunting us? And David looks out there and they said, yeah, I see the giant. Well, can't you tell? He's 9.5 feet tall. You know what David's comeback was? But he's uncircumcised. Yeah, but he's big. But he's uncircumcised. He's not one of us. He doesn't walk in God's favor. I don't care if he's 20 feet tall. He's uncircumcised. This dude has looked at the worst and found the best point you could see. He's 9.5 feet tall. He's wearing 300 pounds worth of armor. You couldn't penetrate it. But he's uncircumcised. So who is he? Who is he? We see Paul and Silas. They're in jail. They're in their cell. There's no doubt cells on each side of them across the hall from them. You know how these jails are built? And everyone's in there, with their banjos and their moonshine and their singing. We just don't have enough hee-haw people here. I can see that now. And everyone is just moaning and probably griping and complaining and depressed. Oh, I'm in jail, and I can't believe this, and I don't know if I'll ever get out of here. And Paul and Silas is over there, and I don't know what's going on in their head, but they're talking, and suddenly, you got to picture this situation, because they're hearing everybody say, man, it's terrible in here, because you can imagine those jails. Man, they were dark, they stunk. There wasn't bathrooms. They're getting fed swill, and it's conditions beyond what anyone could ever imagine today. It's terrible. Nothing good going on here. But I can picture Paul and Silas, and they're talking, and while everyone's pointing out the worst, I can hear Paul now. It's like, Silas, you hear that? Yeah, Silas going, yeah, I don't know. What are you hearing, cockroaches? And Paul's like, no, say something a little louder. Check out the acoustics in this place. Let's sing a song. Next thing you know, they're singing a song. Blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place. They go, man, these acoustics are hot in here. They're in horrendous conditions. Somehow they found something good in there. It's like, check out the acoustics in this place. This is better than the shower. And they're singing. What's the story of the great optimists of the Bible? They become kings. They become great leaders. They escape their prisons. They become great apostles. Every great man and woman of God had one thing in common with a couple people that were exceptions, and they got fired. They were optimists. Now, I know some people don't like it because when I talk about this, because if there's someone in the Bible, they've got to be next to God, right? God would not dare write about someone to show us their frailty and their imperfections to make us feel better, right? God would only write about people who were already there. They've already arrived, so we can see how we need to be, right? Say wrong. A lot of great men of God. Elijah was a great man of God. Elijah called down fire. Man, this dude stood his ground, and he was somewhere borderline between confident and arrogant. It's like, build your altar, man. Put your meat on there. Cry, man. Cut yourself. Gnash your teeth. He's dogging them, man. These false prophets are crying out to their false gods to send fire down and consume their sacrifice. And, man, Elijah's just having a field day. Well, maybe he's on vacation. And forgot to tell you guys. He's telling them stuff like this. Then he says, well, are you guys done yet? And then he says like this simple prayer, very unlike the prayers that we try to pray sometimes when we need God to move. When we're begging and crying out, thinking, well, if I get a little louder, God will hear me. No, it's just a simple little prayer. So God, do your thing. Fire comes from heaven, and God's been awesome, and Elijah's been awesome. And then Elijah somehow becomes a pessimist after seeing that. Kind of reminds me of the body of Christ. Seeing God do incredible things. And we still end up being pessimists. He starts whining and crying in his beer, and yeah, they had beer back then. I don't know if he drank it, but anyone that's as melancholy as Elijah did probably was hitting the beer too. I don't know. He is just gloom, despair. God comes to him and says, what is your problem? You've just called down fire from heaven, and there are 350 prophets after that, and God says, go and kill them, and I don't even know how many sidekicks Elijah had. But they're going in there with swords, and they're killing hundreds of false prophets, and these false prophets are just standing there taking it. God has given them favor beyond belief. He has seen things that you and I can't imagine, and now he's a pessimist. God says, what's your problem? He says, well, I'm the only one. I'm all by myself. There's nobody else good. No one else loves you, God, like I love you. I'm the only man of God. I'm all by myself. Really? Well, who helped you just slaughter the false prophets of Baal? Because you did not do that by yourself. What about this school of prophets that you were involved in? Where are they at? See, the reality was, if you read the story, he was not by himself, but that's how he saw it. He became a great pessimist. And then God did something that we glorify greatly. Preach it as though it was some kind of reward. God said to Elijah, Elijah, you need to go find a replacement. This is your 30-day notice. He went and he found Elisha. He trained Elisha up to take his place. And when Elisha was ready, God sent a fiery chariot down and scooped up Elijah and took him home. We make it a very glorious going away thing. The reality is Elijah got canned because of his pessimism and got replaced. Moses, though in good health, the Bible said, got taken out of this world because he became a great pessimist. And he couldn't take the people of God anywhere except in circles. God canned him even though he was in good health and hired Joshua, the great optimist.